Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, thank you for your testimony and your patience today. When I look over the Independent Fiscal Office's major responsibilities, I notice that some of them are to convene a revenue conference, provide a preliminary revenue estimate, provide a final revenue estimate. But Act 120 of 2010 didn't create an independent revenue office, created the Independent Fiscal Office, and it was created to provide nonpartisan fiscal analysis of budgetary issues. And we would agree the budget's made up of expenses and revenue, and we've talked a lot about your responsibility and your tasks associated with the revenue side of the budgetary issues as it's described here. My question is, what level of access does your office have to data so that you can, analyze spending decisions, looking at employee compensation, where money's being spent, compare that to other states, to give just as thorough of an analysis on the spending decisions of the $30 billion as you do with the revenue, the level of detail that you go to for revenue analysis. Since you have such a legal responsibility, can you maybe talk about the level of data that the administration provides you? Obviously, those mandatory expenses you mentioned come from contracts. So if they're going into contract negotiations, do you get to analyze that to assess the impacts that it's going to have on future budgets?
As you noted, most of our resources are devoted towards the revenue side of the budget. We do have access to the state accounting system, so we can observe at a high level the expenditures and to a certain extent cash flows. But I would characterize that it's at a high level. We can't see the underlying detail.
Right. So $30 billion, and it's almost like we just assume that everybody's making the most responsible decisions, but the independence of your office is of value to us. I think that's why we created it, and I think you've done a tremendous job on the revenue side. But I would really like to maybe work with you in the future about ways that we could empower the office to also have the level of analysis on the expense side, because I think it is absolutely missing. And tools like Penn Watch that was put in place for you and the media and everybody else to analyze the spending, let's just say, has not met those goals as we saw it when it was passed. I would like to talk about one thing in your testimony. It mentions that the fiscal year that we just came through, so on July 1st, when we came into this fiscal year, you mentioned that we had a carry forward balance of $266 million. So when we ended the year, we had $266 million more than we spent, correct?
That is correct.
Folks back home in Beaver County, they'd call that a surplus, but so I'm just going to refer to it as a surplus. So $266 million in a surplus last year. You mentioned in your testimony that that was a result of unexpected large revenue gains, correct? These one-time transfers or sources of funds, correct?
You could
some of it.
Many of it, yes, but I would say I would point to the S-Chief's proposal as being particularly unexpected.
And over the last 5 years, we've ended the year, we've had a surplus of $260 last year, $83 million the year before, $540 million before, $672 million the year before, and $1 billion the year before. We ended the last 5 years with a surplus, roughly total of about $4 billion. Now, we can credit that, a large part of that, to these one-time sources that have been almost, there's been a lot of critics of those one-time sources, but if we didn't have those transfers, that money likely would have came from some tax increase, correct?
Assuming the revenues were needed, they'd have to come from some source.
Right. So let's assume that there weren't spending cuts to offset that $4 billion, and they had to spend at that level. They'd be, we would need to increase taxes. There's consequences for every tax increase, correct? I mean, there's economic consequences if we were to raise just about any tax in the books, correct?
Taxes do affect behavior and the economy.
And so if we've invested $4 billion in what we think is noble programs, and we've done it without a tax increase, I would characterize that as responsible budgeting, in that we've delayed taking more money out of the economy, yet invested $4 billion. Would you characterize that as a responsible first step before we raise taxes, that you should look at means to increase funding that does not have the consequences that a tax increase would?
I would characterize it as a tax increase as one option that should be considered, and all options should be open.
But not taking those transfers and those one-time sources that have been criticized extensively over the last 5 years. By not doing that, we would therefore just be leaving that money, let's say, in a savings account or somewhere else, not getting invested, correct?
Presumably, it would remain in the account and collect interest.
I think it would be irresponsible to raise taxes without those one-time sources. That's my opinion. I appreciate the work that you do and your independence, and I would encourage us to give you as much flexibility. Whether it has to be statutorily, let's introduce a bill and get it passed, because your level of analysis and your independence on the revenue side is exceptional and a tremendous asset to the General Assembly. We also need it on the expense side. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Bullock.